Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Several people sent me a story out of Indianapolis, including Todd. Thank you very much. The Indianapolis Star reported it, as did several other news organizations. And the question is, if you go into a roundabout, a traffic circle, and you go into it and you're about to go out of it, must you use your turn signals to indicate your intentions while in the roundabout? And the interesting thing is, I have to admit, I hadn't stopped to think about this one before because I assumed you don't. And I've never seen anybody use a turn signal in a roundabout. Now, where I live, roundabouts are not common yet, but they have come into several intersections. And what's sad about it is I actually like roundabouts. I've been to places where roundabouts are extremely common. And then I've also been to places where roundabouts are unheard of. And unfortunately, when a roundabout gets brought into an area that's never had them before, it causes confusion and consternation. And I can tell you right now, there's a roundabout 3 miles from my house. And I can count on, if I go there and there's any traffic, there being people who are just stopped because they're not sure what they're supposed to do at the roundabout. Someone's over here going around and they stop here. Well, who knows? Maybe they'll do a full circle and leave. I don't know. So I also know, and I've heard from people in Florida, that there's something about everything else going on in Florida, and you throw a roundabout into the mix, and suddenly you've got just a cross between a Benny Hill skit and hilarity ensues. So the question is, signaling on a roundabout, is it necessary by law? And as of right now, at least in Indiana, the answer is no. An appellate court in Indiana has said specifically you do not need to use a turn signal in a roundabout. Now, you might say, wait, the Court of Appeals in Indiana weighed in on this? Why? Well, as you can imagine, drugs are involved. It often happens that when little tiny picayune issues of traffic law get litigated to the higher courts, it's because that was the basis of a stop in traffic that led to the finding of drugs or other contraband. So you often find people who will fight that issue because if you can get that stop invalidated, then you might be able to get the other evidence suppressed. A motorist was driving on a roundabout in Warsaw when he exited without signaling, according to court documents. A police officer stopped him for failing to signal, then discovered drug paraphernalia in his vehicle. The motorist was charged with felony drug possession. The case focused, of course, on the evidence suppression, but it wound up asking the question, must drivers signal when exiting a roundabout? And the appeals court said, in short, the answer is no. But not everyone agrees. Carmel Mayor James Brainerd, who is leader of the so-called roundabout capital of the country, said, why would a roundabout turn be different than any other turn? Well, I'll tell you why. A roundabout is actually just one continuous turn. Okay? So, I mean, should you leave your left turn signal on while you're going around the roundabout and then turn your right signal on when you're exiting? He says it just doesn't make logical sense that because it's a circle opposed to a square, you would treat it differently. Brainerd, who read the court's decision, told Indy Star signaling on a roundabout should eventually be required and result in tickets for people who fail to do so. This is idiotic. He's long touted roundabouts as being safer and cheaper than intersections with traffic lights. Well, yeah, and I like roundabouts, like I said. Since 1998, the city has built 128 roundabouts at a cost of about $500,000 to $3 million a piece. There are, of course, roundabouts all throughout the state and the country and the world. That includes Kosciuszko County, I think I said that right, where the Warsaw motorist was driving through a 3-exit roundabout on September 21st, 2018. And of course I know I'm going to get 100 people saying, Steve, you mispronounced that. As he exited westbound, according to appeals court opinion, a Warsaw police officer noticed that he had failed to signal. The officer believed that was a traffic infraction because the officer had always been instructed that you needed to signal for exiting a roundabout. Yeah, let's go sit at a roundabout and watch the cop cars go through and see how often they signal. The motorist seemed nervous, the officer, the appeals court said. The officer searched the vehicle and found a digital scale that tested positive for methamphetamine and other objects, according to court documents. So, of course, the fact that you seemed nervous when pulled over by a police officer, if that was grounds for a search, boom, you can search every car. Because whoever is not nervous when being pulled over by a cop? I don't know. Facing several drug-related charges and the possibility of 2.5 years in prison, the motorist went to suppress the evidence and argued that because he didn't violate Indiana statute regarding turn signals, the stop was in itself unlawful. The state, of course, argued that leaving a roundabout is deviating from the normal flow of traffic and requires using a turn signal. And, of course, are you deviating from the normal flow of traffic when you leave a roundabout? A trial court sided with the motorist, finding the evidence should be suppressed, so they took it up on appeal. Now, Indiana law, and again, this is just Indiana specifically, on signaling requires drivers turning right or left to signal no less than 200 feet before turning or changing lanes. 200 feet. So here's the deal. The Indiana Department of Transportation even does say that you should signal before exiting a roundabout. The problem is there's not 200 feet to signal in there most times. So the appeals court says in its decision that while roundabouts aren't specifically excluded from the statute, the intersections were not widespread at the time the laws were established. Any assumption that the signaling statute specifically applies to roundabouts fails to withstand scrutiny when the reality and logistics of roundabouts are considered. Simply put, roundabouts make it virtually impossible to signal at the distance the law requires. So this means that if a cop wanted to, they could sit there and ticket everybody going through a roundabout. Because if you don't signal 200 feet before your turn, you get a ticket. And if you go in and you... It can't be done. So, Brainerd, that's the mayor I talked about earlier, doesn't believe the situation is that complicated. He says that traffic's moving counterclockwise. Drivers have a number of options. And one of the things that the Court of Appeal says is that, for instance, a motorist could exit the roundabout when he has traveled straight through. So in other words, you're traveling due north, and you go into the roundabout, and you don't take the first one, you take the second exit, and you continue due north. Have you really deviated from the flow of traffic? Okay? And the Court of Appeal says, not really. And then, of course, if you do make the turn, you didn't have 200 feet to make the signal. So they actually asked the question, does exiting a roundabout, which often involves the driver simply veering to the right, involve a turn? Or does it depend on the angle of the exit and the degree to which the driver must rotate his steering wheel? So Brainerd said a driver can exit at the first street, go straight through, or exit at the second street, or go 3/4 around and leave at the third street. Or do a complete U-turn and go back the way they came. And at what point should you signal a roundabout? He says, well, another car in there knowing where the other car is going makes it safer. It's just common sense. Brainerd and the appeals court said the law should be updated. Mentioning Hamilton County, the court said that there are numerous roundabout varieties and configurations. All of this convinced us that Indiana code is a square peg that cannot fit into a roundabout hole. You have to understand that for a court of appeals, that's a lot of humor right there, my friends. But, I'll tell you right now, they will have to fix this with statutes, meaning that somebody somewhere has got to sit down and say, okay, do we require this or do we not require this? But I suspect in many states, courts will rule thus, and that is that unless there's a specific law saying ye must signal before exiting a roundabout, that simply going into a roundabout and not using your turn signals will not be considered a violation of the turn signal law. I don't know if it's been litigated in Michigan yet. I will go take a look. I don't think it has, though. But it looks like this one, an Indiana ruling, is early, maybe one of the first. And we're going to see more of these pop up. But I suspect somewhere along the line, they're going to sit down, do some studies, and figure out exactly how to make this work with a statute that specifically addresses roundabouts. But meanwhile, in Indiana, you don't need to use your turn signals for the time being. Todd, thanks for the story. And the story is from the Indianapolis Star. Crystal Hill wrote it. Questions, comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Brilliance is typically the act of an individual, but incredible stupidity can usually be traced to an organization.